In the works of Hayles and Haraway, the figures of the cyborg and the posthuman are used in order to reconfigure the relations between humans as well as between humans and their environment. So starting from your idea that finding the melancholic digital subject translate in the language of failure, of technological singularity, do you think that these images of the posthuman and the cyborg help us to think through the complexity of our dwelling in digitality?
Yeah, they do. Let me just, if you don't mind, I'll just broaden it out a little bit.
Okay.
Because I think that the modern century is introduced by these three thinkers, what I call the will to technology. I think it's a historical epoch within which we're living. And the thinkers are Heidegger, Marx, and Nietzsche. I mean, Marx accurately predicts the future of capitalism as the dominant form of capital formation, and predicts really the disappearance of capitalism itself as capitalism moves by its own logic into an increasingly technological form. Heidegger, anticipates correctly the logic of technological nihilism, both as the saving grace, with his nod to the cosmology of God on the one hand, and to the notion of the malice of rage. And Nietzsche correctly anticipates that feelings of ressentiment, injury, and states of injury, malices of rage, will become part and parcel of contemporary identity formation and increasingly will be generalized into contemporary politics itself. So those three, the will to technology, I think, is the historical epoch within which we're living, and its great anticipatory prophetic figures are Nietzsche, Marx, and Heidegger. The three thinkers that I think who have come up, who really fulfill what they are saying, but in very fulfilling at the same time undermine what Nietzsche, Marx, and Heidegger have had to say, are the figures of Judith Butler and Donna Haraway and Catherine Hayles. And they give rise to, because they've lived out the historical epoch of completed nihilism. They've lived out the epoch of the will to technology itself, and they are, in their writings, the lessons are drawn from this. And they drill them in three different ways. I mean, Judith Butler speaks from a postmodern perspective, and she's drawn to the notion of contingency and vulnerability and frailty, and of the political fury that is felt when, in fact, contingency threatens to break out itself. So she describes the postmodern adventure in that way. A thinker like Catherine Hayles is very different. Catherine Hayles is not a postmodernist. She's a posthuman thinker. And she doesn't think about contingency as much as she thinks about complexity. And finally, you'd have a thinker like Donna Haraway. Donna Haraway is not a cyborg thinker. She was a cyborg thinker earlier on, but that was on her fallen side in some ways. Donna Haraway, in all her recent writings, her favorite emblematic way of living and way of thinking is to think of companion species. And that's, a dramatic attack on the notion of the cyborg itself. She has a much more, what Foucault would say is a question of lower epistemological profile, but I'd say a much more political import. How do you establish real relations of reciprocity, intermediation, mutual respect, and care among and between different species itself? And thus, how do you take better care of yourself in some ways, forms of reconciliation? So I think these three thinkers form a trajectory of critical feminism that simultaneously completes the writings of Marx, Nietzsche, and Heidegger, and effectively undermines their predictions about the will to technology. So in that sense, that's a broad way of answering the question, but in that sense, I would just replace that. I would say it's the cyborg. It's not the cyborg, but it's the companion species. It's the question of complexity in the creative human, post-human subject. And it's the question of contingency and the contingent human relations in a postmodern situation, which really are the three creative trajectories of life as we live it today. got a final tricky question?
Yeah, but maybe we'll like a wrap up of
Yep.
this very interesting commentary. So basically, are you trying to say that the posthuman, the cyborg, or the companion species
Yeah, the
are not
companion's different than that. The companion's a demolition derby towards a cyborg.
Yeah.
So to put it in three different terms, then you could talk about, on the one hand, the contingency that Butler puts forward, the complexity that Hayles offers, and the companionship that Haraway offers.
Or
as three different terms.
hybridity, I should have mentioned hybridity.
Hybridity is how you would characterize the companionship.
Yeah.
And so that seems like a particularly appropriate word then. Do you think that these three things, and hybridity in particular, are promising heuristic tools that can help us to make sense of technology and the will to technology in terms of relationality, perhaps, rather than in the terms of nihilism? Something like that.
Yes. Yeah, then let me go back to Heidegger. Because I've been thinking about this question. Because I think the future is prefigured in the question in terms of complexity, hybridity, and contingency. And the three emblematic thinkers of these are Butler, Hayles, and Haraway. Having said that, though, it takes me back to Martin Heidegger, who I've been struggling with a lot. And particularly, I've been thinking through the debate between Martin Heidegger and Jean-Paul Sartre. And go back to Heidegger's essay and letter on humanism. Because Heidegger in this is asking, asking the question of in the letter of humanism, is really reacting to Jean-Paul Sartre's, the future of humanism itself. Sartre writes an essay on existentialism and humanism with this famous political precept, theoretical political slogan, that existence precedes essence. That we find, in fact, that in the face of the death of God, that we find contingent possibilities for contingency and vulnerability and frailty and hybridity and complexity in the world by acting in history itself. And he stakes his claims on the possibility of political subjectivity in history. Now, I've read my Sartre, but I've also read Camus, where Camus will say, well, that doesn't hold true for very long, because as soon as human beings stake their claims with identity on questions of subjectivity of acting in history, what typically arises is feelings of absolute morality and absolute ethics. And you get absolute murder is committed in the names of absolute ethics, and absolute torture is committed in the names of fealty to questions of absolute violence itself and absolute justice. So that's the debate. Heidegger comes on the scene and writes the letter on humanism. And this has to do with relationality. And Heidegger just refuses this. Heidegger refuses everything that comes before him. He says, in the face of the death of God, we give up the notion of a divine subjectivity which is horizoned by the divinity. He says, should we then move towards Marx? We think of human subjectivity will be defined by being a laboring being. Should we move to Agamben? Heidegger doesn't say this, of course, Agamben's writing after him. Human beings would be marked by questions of exceptionality and the norm. Or Sartre, human beings are marked by moving into history itself. And Heidegger refuses that. Because Heidegger recurs to something else. He says human subjectivity is lived in relationship. Human identity is lived in relation. But it's always lived in relationship to the truth of being, to the house of being. I've been reading and rereading this essay, the house of being and the truth of being. And first of all, I said, well, why doesn't Heidegger talk about the air of being? Although certainly Catherine Hayles would talk about the air of being, of swerves of being itself. But he's not. He doesn't move in that direction. And he says to know what the truth of being is, the aletheia of being, that we in fact need to really stop talking. We need to, in some ways, to learn how to think for the first time. We need to follow Nietzsche, a language of dissent. And what we need to descend into is into the region of the nameless, into the region in which we begin to feel ineffably that which is unknowable in existence itself. And he then moves to the following essay, like in What Calls for Thinking. He calls on Holderman, his favorite poet. We are a sign that it is not. We are a sign that is not read. we feel no pain. It is almost as if we had lost our tongue in foreign lands itself. It is a beautiful poem. So he finds a language of poetry, a way of moving into an understanding of relationality, arts and aesthetics, the language of poetry, the language of that which is outside the regimes of intelligibility, will give us some sense of how we withdraw into that which withdraws. And I think that's core to an understanding of relationality, is this notion that if there's to be a relational aesthetics, a relational understanding of existence, it will be about, or be a horizon by this notion. It'll be faithful to the notion of that which withdraws into the withdrawal, the nameless and the unknowability itself.